Fellow entrepreneurs, welcome. We're on episode 3 of Osmosis. I can't believe how quickly it's going, right? So we had, Yanez, if you guys remember episode 1, we had Dr. Richard Maponya, arguably the doyen of black business in South Africa, on episode 2. And I'm really excited about episode 3, and I'm going to tell you why. There are some people who, in the conversation about entrepreneurship, can tell you about their journey. And you learn a lot from listening to them. You get a bit of inspiration, a bit of information. But there are very few people whose understanding about how to build business is so technical that it feels like you're sitting in a class. So my next guest, a dear friend, is one of those people. Every meeting I have with him, I've got to tell you. I'll ask him a question. He says, sit down, let me draw it for you. He'll pull out a piece of paper or a notepad. He takes a black pen. The pen's always black. So if you're wondering, I think he's a B candidate, but that's a different story. He'll take out a black pen and he'll start drawing the thing he wants you to see. And in his drawing of what he's explaining, you're learning and you're being inspired. So friends, help me welcome Karl Westvig. Karl, welcome.
Thank you, Vusi.
How are you feeling?
I'm inspired. I'm inspired by you and what you do and the fact that you're building entrepreneurs.
But you're kind of doing the same thing too, right?
We work on it. In many fronts. So, certainly in our business, we fund entrepreneurs. We fund business owners.
Right. So before we get into it, I want to go right back. And I'm talking right back, because typically as entrepreneurs, we see what people become. And it's easy to see the finished product. Tell me a bit about the parts that put you together. So where'd you go to school? How were you raised? What religion are you? Tell me about the pitfalls that you've been through in life.
Okay, so let me go back. Probably my formative years, sort of 12, 13 years old, my parents got divorced.
Right.
We'd moved around many times as a family early in my career, early in my school career, and as a result I went to boarding school for high school. And you become very independent. You tend to look after yourself in that process and not depend on too many other people.
I see. And
I suppose that created that sort of underlying platform of making sure you do it yourself, deliver for yourself. I finished school at Wynberg Boys High School, had a good matric, and got an actuarial science bursary from Norwich Life in those days.
You were a smart boy.
I thought I was smart, and then I arrived in the actuarial science class, and I realized I wasn't as smart as I thought I was.
Right.
And I spent 2 years in actuarial science, and actually realized, having worked as an actuarial science student in my VACs, that I didn't want to be in insurance.
Right.
It's a big industry. It's very structured, formalized, etc. And I think I thought I had a bit more personality than that.
Right.
So after 2 years, I changed. I still did a stats honors degree, so I've got a good understanding of data, and fell by accident into credit risk with Foschini in 1994.
Wow.
And the amazing thing was, I joined the industry at the time that they were centralizing credit. So credit at that stage was on ledger cards in the stores.
Right.
So if you walked into the local Piketberg Foschini, the manager knew you, then he knew where you worked, he knew all your circumstances, and he'd give you 200 Rand credits and he'd write it down on a card.
I've heard about this. So this actually used to happen.
It used to happen.
The manager actually ran a balance sheet.
Exactly.
Right.
In store. Right. And so the challenge was that there was no central database. They didn't have computers to centralize it.
Right.
So you never knew whether there was bad debt or not bad debt. And I joined at the time that they created the first centralized debtors platform.
Yes.
Put a terminal into the store, and then every night would poll the data up to a central server. The next step was then to start doing centralized credit granting. So we then had to have application forms filled in. It was faxed into a central call center. We had a bank of 40 fax machines with paper spewing out from 1,000 stores. And we had people on roller skates, literally on roller skates, collecting and running down around to data capturers who would capture the application. And it was last in, first out. So they kept putting the paper on top of it. So if a store phoned to say, where's my application, they'd have to go through all the in trays, and they always process the top one first. So some guy got a 10-minute turnaround, other guys got a 10-day turnaround.
Jeez.
Yeah, so it was inefficient, but it was centralized. And for the first time, we could start collecting data and start building risk models around credit granting. So it was right at the beginning of the industry. We then put in a fax server, so it was then done on first in, first out, not last in, first out. We could track applications. We could have automated links to credit bureaus to do automated checking. And then we put the first scorecards in South Africa into credit lending.
How long did all of this take?
2 years.
So I just want to make sure I understand it. There's some person watching today who can't get a granted credit at Foschini. You guys, that's the problem. You guys did that to them. You're the reason they're not. You're the reason they're not going to a credit bureau and saying your score's too low for you to afford this T-shirt, so you can't buy from us in credit.
There are ways of getting out of that. Pay your bills for one, but there are ways of dealing with this.
How did you arc from your days in corporate to your days at RCS?
Okay, so year one at Foschini was incredible. I traveled extensively.
Yeah.
I was sent to San Francisco. I was sent to New Orleans. Looking at credit models, meeting credit scoring businesses First Data, meeting Fair Isaac, so all the big international businesses. So as a 24-year-old, I had an incredible learning curve. The second year was an implementation year. So we were putting the models in, upgrading systems, learning about fraud, learning about syndicated fraud. And by year 3, I started bumping my head on corporate. So I was asking for tools, and I was being told, we're not supporting another tool, or go through the right procedures, or we don't have funding for it, or we don't. So by year 3, I started getting frustrated.
Right.
And I guess that's why I became an entrepreneur, because I got to a point where I felt I couldn't sit in a structure asking for stuff that was so clear to me and no one else understood.
Right.
So I left there and joined a startup in those days called Direct Access, which is an outbound lender.
I know this. These are, my mom used to get those
Exactly.
It's like posters or postcards that arrive, right?
For personal loans.
You have been granted X amount.
Exactly.
Typically written in green.
That's right.
Right.
Green and a little bit of red. So I joined the team. There were 3 of us, along with a founder who brought the concept from the UK, and we started with an empty floor. We had to find desks. We had to hire the people, train them. We had to write the systems, build scorecards. There were a whole lot of firsts. We were the first to do what they call batch scoring. So we could send a database to the credit bureau, get the scores on each of those customers, pre-qualify them, then send them offers to say it's available. Now, bearing in mind at that stage, we were giving half an hour, 15-minute turnaround and voice-recorded contracts. The bank's personal loans were taking 3 to 4 weeks to turn around an approval on a personal loan. So it just turned the whole personal industry on its head.
You were giving, say that again, half an hour? Without compromising on quality of book?
And was data-driven. So what people in South Africa don't understand is the level of data available on a bureau is extensive. So you can see every inquiry for credit that you've made.
That's right. Yeah.
We can see every line of credit you have.
Right,
Within that line of credit, we can see every month whether you paid or missed your installment,
That's right,
your current balance, the facility available. So it's extensive. Off the back of that, we can create scorecards, which, based on behavior, can approve for credit.
It's not the point of our interview, but I'm keen to just do this quick segue. How do you, if you would, having a conversation with an entrepreneur growing his business, what would you tell him about the importance of making sure that you meet your commitments on time?
It's fundamental. I mean, it's fundamental. So for instance, the challenge if you have no credit is that they can't assess you for credit.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, so what the retailers have been good at in South Africa is providing that first leg in. So if you go and open a store card with a Foschini or Truworths, etc., and build a credit history with them, that'll give you your personal brand, your personal credit history a boost.
Yes, yeah.
When you then start applying to the banks for larger ticket items, etc., the score that gets created from that data is a big leg up to getting credit.
Sure.
When we lend to businesses, we do tend to look at the personal profile as well. We generally underwrite the business, but the personal profile does give an indication of how responsible you are.
I see what you mean. So you're now squarely in RCS. Like,
So we haven't got there yet.
yeah. Oh, okay.
Okay. So direct access. So 2.5 years later, we'd built a 250 million rand book, which was making R1 million a month profit. It was a good business, but we weren't.
Say that again, slower.
We'd built a 250 million rand book.
Yeah.
In 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Making about R1 million a month profit.
Yeah.
So it was a good business.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we weren't shareholders. And we built everything ourselves. So we literally, without supervision, brought everything in, created this business, and we weren't shareholders. We were management, we had some incentives. And I remember sitting at lunch with old colleagues saying, why do we do this ourselves? Why are we doing it for other people? And the three of us then left Direct Access, went back to my old employer, Foschini, and said, you have a strong brand, you have 1 million plus customers in those days, and you have 1,000 stores, and you have funding, you have a balance sheet. Why don't you back us to build a business for yourselves? So they took a 70% share in those days. We had a BE partner alongside us, Mineworks Investment Corporation,
Yeah.
MIC, MIC. And we then launched RCS with Foschini.
Why did you need a BE partner?
At that stage, it wasn't a requirement, but what was, and it's a good lesson for everybody, is if we walked to Foschini just as 3 individuals, they wouldn't give you equity. Corporates don't like giving equity. Corporates want 100% control.
Yes, of course.
But if we had a third party involved and a bit of capital behind us,
Yes.
then we're not beholden to the corporates, in which case the corporate's prepared to share equity.
Right.
Yeah, so if we're going as a package with data, experience, and a bit of funding, then we can negotiate equity.
Right.
On our own, we wouldn't have been able to.
Right.
Yeah, so that was our leg in. And having learned what we had, so I had the credit risk experience from the Foschini world and understanding their portfolio. I had a track record now from Direct Access where we'd built a similar business without brand endorsement. So we were buying external lists and lending to them. And now we're walking into a Foschini environment where we know the data, we know the customers, strong brand, and it was an unbelievable business model.
Go back. You say a lot of things really quickly. What do you mean buying external lists? What's that mean?
So there are, POPI is going to be an issue at some point for people giving you permission to use your data.
Right.
But there are many data sources that have lists of South African population.
Right.
You can acquire that list. And you can then take that list and go to a credit bureau and say, credit score them for me, tell them who are good payers.
Right.
I can then send Vusi an offer, a green postcard, to say you qualify for 10,000 Rand.
Okay.
Now, when we arrived at Foschini, and that became the beginning of RCS, we had access to 1 million Foschini clients. We knew how they paid their Foschini accounts. We knew how they paid their external accounts. And we made an offer to say, as a Foschini customer, we're going to give you a preferential rate and a preferential offer. Our take-up rates were phenomenal. It was a valuable offering.
I mean, that business was so ubiquitous. It got to a point where you saw the little sticker outside every store, right?
So that was the second part of RCS. So the first part was a direct loan,
right,
where we'd send offers directly to people. And then within Foschini, they'd created a card business for non-Foschini retailers.
right,
And that was RCS Cards. So they would go in the early days to Muller's optometrists,
yes,
and you could walk in and get an OptiCard, which was an optical credit card, and that was underwritten by RCS. So they built this platform. We then rolled the Foschini business into RCS, and that became the RCS card. And they're now the largest provider of third-party credit to retailers in South Africa.
Oh, wow. In the early days, I imagine, and you were there at the setup, so you would have seen this thing grow. The entrepreneurs we have in our community battle with a number of things. They battle with governance, with risk, with financial management, etc. But the single thing I think all of them share is they battle with growth. It's just, how do you keep a handle on stuff when you went from 2 people to 20 people to 200 people? What changes? So what would you say to the entrepreneur watching this battling with growth?
Sure, it's a big question. I could spend hours talking about managing growth. So if I try and distill it, So the first thing that I look for is a strong team.
Sure.
Team that you can depend on. Okay. So the most successful businesses are not one-man operations with resources. They tend to be teams. They tend to be 2, 3, 4 people that together create stuff. As an entrepreneur, as a one man, you always have blind spots and weaknesses that you don't deal with. So I know for myself, I love the building part, I love the visioning part, I love creating stuff. I'm not great at the structured admin stuff behind the scenes. So if you leave me on my own, I'm going to charge ahead and have a whole lot of ideas and create stuff, and things are going to fall behind somewhere else. So I generally have a strong finance or structured person with me. I don't necessarily have strong marketing skills. So if you can find a team which has strong finance, structuring, governance skills, someone who's the creator, and someone who's got the marketing, building, distribution, then you have a strong team as a starting point. And you must feed off each other in that process. So if you look at the Apples, the Googles, the Amazons, they all had teams of people that started. The next thing I look for is distribution. How do you create distribution? So you need a customer value proposition. People either get hung up on the tech, if they're a fintech,
Yes.
or they get hung up on the product.
Yes.
They don't understand how to get to the market.
Yes.
And the market's critical. So if I want to sell pens, but no one's using pens anymore, I've got a problem.
Absolutely.
I can have a great pen, but it's not going to help me. So, I mean, in our case with an RCS, we had a product people demanded. People have been needing credit for 2,000 plus years. So lending wasn't the problem. How do I get it to people in a format that's more convenient for them? And it's got to be significantly better. So do I want to go stand in a branch and being intimidated by a branch manager and take 4 weeks to get a decision? Or do I do it anonymously over the phone, pre-qualified, so I've taken the fear of rejection already out the process?
Got you.
And it's delivered overnight by EFT to my bank account. Why would I not take your product?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
And then distribution-wise, when you're working with partners who already have a relationship and a brand association, it's hard starting from scratch without a brand. But if you can create brand association where there's a level of trust already, it just makes it infinitely easier.
Why is the brand important?
So it's funny in the lending space because the lender's taking the risk, not the customer.
This is it.
But customers don't see it like that because they don't know what the pitfalls are. They don't know what the fine print says. They don't know what's going to happen if I don't pay. So there's actually a level of fear in taking credit.
If the brand with whom I'm taking the credit is unfamiliar to me.
Is unfamiliar.
I see.
Whereas if I go and I've had a card with Fashini for 10 years or 20 years, and Fashini come along and say, I'm going to grant you 10,000 Rand credit, the cost is X, all those boxes have been ticked.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's a reason why people keep going to the Spur, because they understand what they're going to get.
It's interesting, right, that the consumer has a certain number of things that are wired into how he or she makes decisions. And that sometimes as entrepreneurs, we don't consider that wiring. We just charge ahead with whatever it is that we want to do. So you answer the question around growth. You say distribution is important, the team is important.
Yep.
You mentioned the brand, which clearly is important. You've not spoken about money here.
I mean funding to fund the growth.
Yeah.
So funding tends to be, it's available if there's a need for it. I'm being a bit obtuse here, but so I've never had a problem raising funding when I've got at least a pilot or a good concept or a good distribution or a good partner.
Wow.
Okay, so when we started RCS, we had to put some of our own money in and we couldn't afford all of it. So we had to go knock on the banks to say, now if I was an entrepreneur without Fashini as a partner in the venture, I wouldn't have got the money up front.
Sure.
But the fact that Fashini were buying in, the first question from the bank was, can we also buy equity? The bank wanted to buy into us before we'd started.
Oh, wow.
When we said, no, the equity's taken up, they said, okay, we'll fund you. So brand credibility is big. Good distribution model, critical. good customer value proposition, critical, track record, critical. If you've got those 4 things, you're unlikely not to be able to find money.
So you're saying money is a consequence of, not an input in.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Oh, there's a key takeaway.
Yeah. If you're starting from scratch with no track record, no brand, no anything, it's very hard to raise money. Then it's friends and family that you have to find funding from.
Sure.
And you won't get debt in the early stages. People think they can borrow money. You can't borrow against something that
doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Okay. But the funding part is actually the easier part to solve.
Again, so how did you manage growth? Few people, then this thing grows. I mean, did you, the entrepreneurs watching this, I can assure you, are having the sleepless nights. So they're worried about the tasks that go undone, the emails that go unanswered, the phone calls that don't get replied to by their people. And typically a lot of the entrepreneurs we find are just they're in that space where they're getting scale of opportunity, but they don't have rigor of process. So I'm getting X thousand number of opportunities coming in, but my processes aren't rigorous enough that I can capitalize on all of these. And as a result, I'm just frustrated. I don't have enough time, so I never catch up with myself. Have you ever found yourself in that situation? And if you have, how did you work your way out of it?
So all the time. So when I look at a business, so for me a business is a puzzle. I've got a picture in my head and there are pieces that need to be fitted together. And I guess I've probably had the experience having understood operations, understood finance, understood systems and how they all interact. Okay, so I've got a picture in my head of how it needs to be structured. If you find yourself as an entrepreneur chasing your tail every single day and fighting fires, it means you haven't thought through some of the longer term issues and put structures in place to support it.
Yeah.
Okay, so every night if you're lying awake about things that are failing, systems are a problem, this is a problem, that's a problem, you need to take a step back. And so when I got the retail capital business I'm in now, when I got back involved, there was lots of crisis management. So there were always issues with systems being down or something happening. And you've got to step back and say, where do I need to invest and what are the important components?
Yeah.
So the first thing, we needed growth. The distribution platform we had was limited.
Yeah.
So the first thing we looked at is said, how do we expand the product, create more lines of distribution so we're not dependent on one channel?
Yeah.
So that was the first start.
Yeah.
Secondly, why are we paper-based? So we need to apply a bit more technology here.
Right.
So underwriting was paper-based.
Right.
People were filling in forms, they were couriering it to the office, we were capturing it, and we're back where we were in Fashini in 1994 with faxes coming out the fax machines.
Right, right.
And we just said to the guys, 2 weeks no paper. And in 2 weeks that was the challenge. So you can put challenges into the team, whether it's yourself or people in your team, where you say to them, we will not have paper in 2 weeks' time. And 2 weeks later, we had 90% of paper was removed.
Unbelievable.
They scanned it in, put it into a system, and to digitize some of the stuff.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how people don't believe they can change, but when you set them a task and they change and they believe they can change becomes easier and easier and easier.
Got you.
Down the track.
Got you.
So use technology to do some of those things. Develop metrics, develop KPIs. So Jack Welch from GE will say, when he looks at a business, he analyzes the whole business, looks at all the metrics, he picks the 3 most important, and then he worries that to death.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Just 3?
Just 3. And in any business, there's generally not more than 3 important factors that are critical to your success.
Yes.
The rest is noise.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So in our business, for instance, if I look at my conversion rate, number of appointments made, margin, my maintained margin, there are only 3 or 4 things that are critical. And if I focus just on those 3, I'll be successful despite the noise. So simplify. I mean, it's the message you got to have. Simplify your business.
All right. Because at the end of the day, you can't out-task everything, right?
You can't.
It needs to be a focus. All right.
Yeah.
When we come back, I want to have the conversation further with Karl, but I then want to get into what Karl's doing now, and then a little bit about where his business is going, where the journey of this country is going, and most importantly, what you and I can learn from him. Don't go away. This is Osmosis. In my mind, entrepreneur philosopher really is. He just gets the concept of the concept. And he's an interesting and fascinating man because he's one of those people from whom you not only draw inspiration and information, but actually you just learn a lot. Just before the break, Karl and I were talking about his journey, how he went from Foschini to RCS, and we're about to segue from how he built, or he and the management team built RCS to close on 800 people, to what he does today, which is Retail Capital. So would you, for our viewers, just give us a sense of how you went from RCS and then into what you do now, which is the CEO of Retail Capital?
Okay, so the RCS business got to a size where we now had large institutional shareholders, both Foschini, and we brought Standard Bank in. And as an entrepreneur, I had no more equity. I sold my equity out at that time. And so I had a 3-year period to work out, and when I left, I wanted to build stuff again. And it's hard to build in a large structure where you have institutional shareholders. So I went out my own again, and I invested in 6 or 7 different businesses over a period of time. The ones where I had some industry understanding were successful in various forms. Where I had no industry understanding, I failed dismally.
What'd you learn there?
Stick to what you know. It's very tempting when you've exited a business to say, I'd love to solve a new problem. But the reality is you don't actually have that deep understanding of how things work.
Trust me, I get it, brother.
So I went back into the lending space, financial services space.
Have you read The Richest Man in Babylon?
No.
Oh, man. So I'm going to gift you the book.
It's
a really good book, but it was the very first business book I ever read. And the book is about the fellow who was the richest man in Babylon. And he tells in the book stories about how he made wealth. But it all keeps coming down to the same thing. Stick to what you know.
Absolutely.
Invest in what you know, you put money behind what you know, and then you manage and worry about what you know. And so his whole thing was, whereas the rest of my friends are diversifying into things they knew nothing about, I just plowed down a path of something I understood, and that's how I accumulated this amount of wealth, right? So you finish at retail, at RCS, you invest in these 7 businesses. Some do well, some less so. And you're in this hiatus now. Where does Retail Capital pop up?
So, having built business before, I was called by some in the industry to say, is a cool idea, and can they meet for coffee, and can we talk about whether it's doable?
Yes.
And this particular person was had built a business before, was now living in working in Joburg, living in Cape Town and commuting, and wanted to get back to Cape Town. So the 3 of us sat down, had coffee, had breakfast, and he said there's a business opportunity to lend to SME retail, which doesn't exist in South Africa and doesn't make sense. And it's basically lending against cash flows. Banks lend against balance sheets. They lend against assets. So if you want to go and borrow money from the bank, the first thing they say is, what collateral do you have? And if you don't have collateral, then unless you've got a super bulletproof business plan and credibility and they're not going to lend it to you. It was a great idea. So we said, let's give it a go. And Dave, in that case, was going to run it day to day to move back to Cape Town. He was going to run the business. So we became investors, shareholders in the business. I played the chairman role. So I was actively involved in the first year in terms of setting up the concept, finding funding for it, hiring people, etc., etc. And then I left it to Dave. The last thing you want in a business is 2 bosses. One person's got to make the call every day. And so I was happy to play the sounding board role for Dave, but I didn't want to start getting involved in the day-to-day running operations because it just undermines Dave. So he ran that for 3.5 years. And then he decided he wanted to go and sail. So he did the Clipper race, around the world yacht race, and it's a year-long process. So he stepped down, sold his equity, moved back to the UK, and then did his sailing trip. And I was busy exiting another business, and Retail Capital was a large part of my investment, a lot of my portfolio. So I said, well, there's no better person to run it than myself, than trying to find another CEO and trying to look over their shoulder.
That's right, yeah.
So I stepped back in about 2.5 years ago.
Was it a difficult decision for you to make to become executive again?
It wasn't, and probably because I'd watched Retail Capital grow,
right,
and I had views on how I think things should be different.
Right.
and it was easier to step in myself and make those changes.
At a philosophical, thematic level, have you ever battled with old behaviors that keep you back? So a way you used to work that doesn't work for the environment you're in now?
Me personally, or the environment?
No, you.
I don't think about those things.
So I just want to make sure I get it. So at every time the business has grown, you just naturally adjusted to, well, it's grown now, I've got to be this type of leader or this kind of boss, not the one I was yesterday.
I think because I'm always growing the business, I think I'm setting the agenda. Does that make sense?
No.
So I'm not sure. I think I'm quite adaptable anyway to any environment.
Sure.
So I don't think I have one particular style. I tend to adapt my style according to what's there.
I see.
But I'm also setting the agenda. So when I step back in here, for instance, it was a very structured, rigid organization that was living a bit in the past. Legacy systems, legacy thinking. Culturally, people weren't having fun. People were being watched and so on. And I saw a different picture. In my picture, people needed to enjoy coming to work, not come to work because they need to be at work. They need to embrace technology, which they weren't. They needed to diversify distribution channels in terms of new segments. They needed to embrace partnerships. So at that stage, it was retail capital only. So how do we go and partner with a Yoko and a Corker and a SureSwipe and so on? So I had a different picture of the business. And so I suppose I had an agenda when I stepped in, and it was about imparting that picture. And you can't overload the organization with a picture on day one. You can't sort of say to them, we're here now, we're going to be there in 2 years' time, because people don't make that leap so quickly. So
it's too radical a leap.
Exactly. So you have to feed it into the system. So you're saying the starting point was how are we going to fix our sales process? So then we focus on sales. And then how are we going to fix our back office administration? We focus on back office administration. Then how are we going to fix our distribution? And then we pick partnerships. So it's been a journey through that process.
How do you, because I battle with this, how do you remember what the picture is? So typically for me, when I start something, when I start getting into something, the clearest picture I'll have of it is week one. Because I'm removed enough to see the blind spots and the gaps.
Sure.
But once I get immersed in it, sometimes I forget that, there was this part of the puzzle there. So how do you draw it down? Do you write it down? Or do you just have a gift for remembering what the end goal is all the time?
So I have a mental picture that's very simple, if it makes sense. I don't have a detailed picture.
Right.
I have a simple picture. And so when I look at a business, I'll say distribution, and I've got a couple of key metrics. So I only had 10 things I wanted to change in this business.
Right.
10's a lot, but I had 10 things. And one of it was we had at that stage a prospect pool of 20,000 businesses that we could phone and contact. And I said to the team, we need to take it to 50,000. So that was my number, from 20 to 50. So half the stuff was short-term structural changes, fixing reporting lines, fixing responsibilities, scoping, that sort of stuff. And the other half was strategic stuff. The strategic stuff was no paper. And that's not difficult to remember in the picture. But the knock-on effect of reducing paper in the organization means you're forced to digitize, which means you're forced to automate processes. You're forced to automate decision-making. You're forced to... So the no paper, it becomes a philosophy which you drive. Culture, so is a big one. How do you make sure people enjoy what they're doing? So the first thing we did is we sat down and we said, how do we get a metric to work out how engaged people are? So we did a survey, and we were literally 2 months into the business, and I wanted to do the survey as a baseline before I changed anything. So I stepped into the environment and we said, we did two things. We did a Q12 survey. Q12, and people can Google it, is the 12 most important questions that you can ask on staff engagement.
Oh, wow.
And it covers things like, do I have the tools I require to do my job? Is one question. Do I trust my co-workers to do work with me? Do I have a best friend at work? Have I had any recognition in the last 7 days? So by asking these 12 questions, you can very quickly get a picture across your whole organization where the holes are and how engaged people are. We also asked the net promoter score question, but for staff, not for customers, for staff.
Oh, you did an internal NPS?
Internal.
Wow.
And it was one question. How likely
are
you to encourage your friends and family to come and work for Retail Capital?
100%. 100%.
Okay. So our first NPS was a negative score. we had more detractors than promoters.
And you were paying them.
Absolutely. But it gives you a quick metric in your culture. And then we spent the next 6 months saying, where are the holes? So people said they don't have the tools to do the job. So now we're going to understand, what tools do you need to do your job? And that's simple stuff to fix, because you can say, well, I can't get access to the internet because the internet's down all the time.
Let me ask you a question. How do you know the feedback you're getting is correct?
Okay, so everything's relative. You're never 100% sure it's always going to be correct, but it's relative.
Right.
So the first thing we did is we made sure that it's anonymous. So we split it by department, but we'd only look at it at a department score if there were at least, I think, between 3 or 4 responders.
Right.
So you couldn't pick who the person was.
Right.
And then we ran the exercise. We then ran the exercise 6 months later and did the relative check. So what improved, what didn't improve. So if they're lying to you consistently, then things shouldn't change.
Sure.
But things did change. And there were a handful of things that came out which we had to fix, and we fixed, and we gave feedback to the people about it. And it's incredible how quickly that mindset has shifted.
Did you have to let some people go?
So everyone needs the opportunity to perform. So we don't, as a philosophy, we don't just take people out of the business because we think they're the wrong people. We give them every opportunity to perform. And people then ultimately self-select where they want to be, they don't want to be there. So expand on that. So
self-select.
They self-select.
I can't imagine going to the CCMA and saying, I didn't fire him. He self-selected not to be here. So, how does that work? Is that I've never seen the resignation letter.
Yeah,
it says I'm self-selected.
That's a good question. So when you walk a journey with someone and people understand that they have areas they're not strong at and areas they're strong at. Yeah. And if you've got people in the right boxes and they're performing, it's a non-issue. If you put them in a box that they want to be in, but they're not hitting the performance requirements or not adjusting to the culture, or at some point you're going to have a conversation. And the conversation shouldn't be a surprise. When I sit down and say to you, I don't think this is the role for you. Now, we can make it easier for them and help them find another role, internally or externally. But you've got to have those honest conversations.
Jeez, that's tough, eh?
It is
How
tough.
do you manage spillage? So we find that with growth entrepreneurs, typically they start at a size and they have people that fit the pie. But the pie grows, and they don't always have the resources to scale up the number of people. And even if they do, there's a lag process because you've got to go through the recruiting process, finding people, yada, yada. So invariably what happens is parts of the pie, as it grows, then get done by people who weren't originally scoped to do that work. How do you, have you ever come across that, and how did you manage?
All the time.
So how do you manage that, right? How do you manage but this really isn't a part of my job conversation?
So firstly, the people that you have in the organization need to be adaptable. So if and their job isn't that one page on the back of the contract that says these are the 5 things that I do and I don't do anything else.
Right.
If you run an organization like that, then you have a corporate and you've got the wrong people in the organization. Okay, so people need to be adaptable and they need to be able to absorb whatever comes their way. Often people have to do things that they don't have the skill set for. Adaptable people will learn. I mean, we have individuals in the business that will sit at night and watch YouTube videos to train themselves. And that's the culture you need to create, is where there's a constant learning. And you see in a growth business, people either grow into the role with the organization or you get left behind.
Right.
And we've had instances where you've put in a collections manager. And 2 years later, they're now a collections supervisor because they actually have the business outgrown them.
Oh, I see.
Technologically,
I see.
operationally, and then you got to have the hard conversation saying, you were great in that role, but you're not great anymore in that role.
Yeah.
So we can either try and train you up, or you need to accept that we're going to put someone above you.
Yeah.
Those are hard conversations.
Yeah.
But you have to be authentic about them.
Yeah. Off the record, you had a conversation with me about survival mode and the breakfast analogy. Did you, on the record now, tell us a bit more about it?
Sure. So when I sit with entrepreneurs, if people wait for the best time to start a business, they never start it. Okay, so when I say to entrepreneurs...
I told you guys, didn't I tell you? Gems, I told you.
If you plan to start a business, the only way to do it is to throw yourself in it completely and commit.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And that means resign your job, put money in the bank and start spending money. Once you start spending money, you get into survival mode where you have to survive. You don't have alternatives. And that's very powerful instinct. So really what I say to people is, when you have breakfast and you're having bacon and eggs, where the egg's involved, the chicken was involved in laying the egg. The pig was committed. The pig had to die to make breakfast for you. So I say to entrepreneurs, are you the chicken or the egg? Oh, sorry, the chicken or the pig? Yeah. Because you need to be the pig. You need to be committed. Yeah. There's no such thing as a part-time entrepreneur. You might get lucky, but generally, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you've got to commit.
Sure. Finally, before we break, earlier you were having a conversation about how you sort of built the business and you bolted on stuff, and you spoke about the CASE philosophy. What's the CASE philosophy?
CASE philosophy stands for copy and steal everything. Basically, there's very little new stuff in the world. So use your networks and just Google and learn from others. Yeah, and it's so important because a lot of us, I think, get caught in the trap of origination. We go, I've got a problem and I'm trying to solve it. And then we assume we're the first person ever to try and solve this problem. Exactly. And then you go native and you want to build some sort of native system when somebody's 15 years down the path with something far more advanced that you could probably just go to market and get off the shelf. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So when we come back, I want to have a conversation with Karl about the future. So what's the future for the business? What is he busy with now? What's the future for South Africa? Don't go away. Welcome back, friends. We're still in conversation with Karl, who's the CEO of Retail Capital, talking about entrepreneurship, growth, philosophies, what can we learn? And we're now going to get into a conversation about some practical tips for you. And then I want to go about where he thinks the world is going and where the country's going. So, Karl, we see a lot of entrepreneurs who come to us that battle with pitching to investors. And I'm sure it's something you're familiar with. People who've come to you before and said, I have this fantastic idea, or I want to do X. Even internally in your own team, people who go, we should try this. If you were to give any tips to entrepreneurs about how they should be pitching themselves and their businesses, what would they be? So there are a couple of things. So firstly, where possible, have a proof of concept. Right. So a paper-based pitch is very hard. Because there are lots of unanswered questions. Right. Yeah, so if you've managed to cobble, as I said earlier, pieces of a big backer or big partner or whatever, you're more likely to raise something. But as a standalone, test the model, even on a micro scale. I mean, if you're trying a new product, get a couple of prototypes, sell it into the trade, see take-up rates, etc. So proof of concept is one part. Secondly, credibility around the team. Track record where you have it. What I say to entrepreneurs is, depending on the size of the business that you're creating, if you're getting into the corporate type space, get yourself a network of credible people behind you. So if you don't have the track record, create an advisory board, create an advisory panel of people who've done it before, who are, you can put in your letterhead, you can put in your website. So there's credibility behind the team, is critical. Also, never underestimate governance. And people say, well, governance is for later when the business is big. It actually isn't. So the more deliberate you are about how you report, how you put your structures together, the fact that you've got a proper accounting system, that you get monthly management accounts out, that you, if required, have an auditor. So the better your governance, the higher ultimately your valuation is going to be too.
Yeah.
And if I look at the RCS business, when we did a transaction with a bank, if it was my business on my own with average governance, we might have got a 5 times profit multiple. The fact that we had a larger shareholder and strong governance brought to us by the Fashini Group,
Sure.
and they were listed board,
Sure.
we got a 10 times multiple. So the multiple and earnings definitely is driven by governance.
Sure, sure. So it is said to us that South Africa is now open for business. And the conversations about driving entrepreneurship, creating jobs. We have 2019 elections around the corner. And I'm keen to, let me ask the question this way. If the person sitting next to you right now was Cyril Ramaphosa, and admittedly he's not quite as fit or good looking, that's a different conversation. So if you were sitting next to him and having a conversation and you were wanting to advise him on how he should be prioritizing along this area of SMME development, what would you say to him?
So firstly, at a philosophical level, are we trying to create social welfare development? We're trying to create startups and entrepreneurship. So firstly, you need to be shifting the budget towards entrepreneurship and startups. I mean, there have been countries in the world where they've taken a philosophy of saying, let's give every startup a small amount of money. We know there's going to be a high failure rate, but let's give everybody 50,000 or 100,000 Rand. It's almost like a basic grant for entrepreneurs. So that's one way of tackling it. And that's a way you can get many entrepreneurs into the system, and out of that you're going to get good success. That's at the startup space. The other side is, firstly, you need to put more money into the system, and you need to find more distribution channels to get it out there. So what tends to happen is government chases the large balance sheets, so they'll go to the big banks and say, there's R1 billion,
That's right,
and go and stimulate the SME economy. All they do is they take it as cheap form of funding on their balance sheet.
Exactly right.
They don't actually distribute it.
But then it not only that, it goes to the least risky clients.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's GFC all over again, isn't it? The Americans decided to pump money into the monetary supply system, and all that happens is they just cushion the balance sheet of the big banks.
Exactly.
Right?
And even the external DFIs, they're putting money into the large banks in South Africa for SME funding, but firstly, the banks don't have the distribution model to get to those entrepreneurs.
100%.
Okay. And then secondly, they don't have the risk models to deal with it. So their credit committees are still stuck in asset-based lending. They can't give it to entrepreneurs. So find other channels. Find people who understand VC. Fund them. Find people that are running private equity funds that can distribute.
100%.
Go and give the money to alternate lenders like ourselves who are currently funding SMEs. So we've got to work very hard to get money from the likes of the asset managers with lots and lots of governance and structures with no underpin. If the government came to us and said, we'll give you R1 billion guarantee against this sector of the market, if you lend to them, we can take that guarantee to the asset managers
100%.
and leverage that.
100%.
5 times, 10 times. We put 10 billion into the market for them. So the smaller alternate lenders have strong customer value propositions. They have great technology. They have ways of distributing the product. They don't have the scale. Banks have scale, but don't have the capabilities. So how do you put the two together? And government should underpin that.
Sure. This is fascinating for me because you've just basically said we've been looking at this problem completely incorrectly. Everybody's made the assumption that it's not the availability of money, when it's not just that there's not the availability of money, but there's also not a coordinated thinking around how do you fix the problem. Wow.
Agreed.
I told you. Entrepreneur, philosopher. So, next 10 years, where do you hope South Africa goes? And if I'm an entrepreneur and I'm looking for 5x growth top line over the next 10 years, what would be your advice to me?
I think we're fortunate in that we have a new mindset in South Africa.
Sure.
And it's certainly driven politically. We've seen certainly entrepreneurs we're lending into as retail capital, we're seeing a positive sentiment of reinvestment. 6 months ago, they weren't reinvesting. They were saying, I'm not investing. They were looking for money to take money out the country, not to leave it in the country. So we already have a positive shift in mindset. We're going to reinforce that.
Yeah.
And reinforcement equals more reinforcement.
Yeah.
So if our GDP growth rate goes from 0.6% to 1.5 to 2 to 3 to 4%, it becomes the place to invest. Yeah. There's just a natural tide rising in South Africa. Yeah. And I think that's going to happen anyway.
Yeah. So and there's an old saying, the rising tide elevates all ships.
Exactly right. so in that process, people are investing. My advice to entrepreneurs is keep investing. We're in an unbelievable country, and investment here is going to give you the returns. Right. And if you're investing ahead of your competitors, you're going to reap the rewards. Right. Yeah.
Okay. In the event that I am running a business and I am facing serious issues around lack of funding, and two things specifically, lack of funding and inability to access markets, what would be Karl's advice to me?
Sure. So let's split the funding discussion up into two. There's short-term cash flow funding issues, which is not a place you want to be as an entrepreneur. There's long-term capital requirement, which you can plan for. So if you're planning for long-term capital requirement, there are structures you can put in place, and that comes down to credibility, track record, partnership, brand, etc. And that's easy to manage and deal with that before you get to the cash flow problem. Yes. If you're an entrepreneur that you've been running, you haven't been successful, you have an overhead structure, and you don't have revenues to support it, and you have a cash flow crunch, it's very hard to find funding anyway. You can't walk into a bank and get them to lend to you. You're back in the friends and family realm where people are betting on your business, not knowing whether it's going to survive. So my advice is don't get yourself into the cash flow problem. Plan up front. And don't also create overhead before you understand what the horizon looks like. If you're going to go and hire 10 senior executives and expect to make money before you know what your market looks like, that's a problem. You're going to have a cash flow problem. So I guess my advice is planning. Think ahead.
And if I'm not getting market access, I'm talking to large corporates and they are either not biting or they're not coming back to me, what should I be thinking about doing?
Okay, so understand your sell cycle in the market you're in. Right. Okay. So to sell pens to someone on the street is fairly easy because there's lots of customers and they understand the product. The more complex your product and the more complex the organization, the longer sales cycle you're going to have. So if you're trying to sell an Oracle system to a large bank, it's going to take you 5 years, assuming they're going to buy it because you have the right product. So you need to understand the expectations. And the challenge with entrepreneurs is they always overestimate the short term and they underestimate the long term. So that they always think they're going to land the big deal this year without knowing it's going to happen.
In the words of Alan Greenspan, irrational exuberance.
Exactly. But on the other side, they underestimate the long term. So you tend to operate within your own current confines and look incrementally when actually there's exponential growth out there. Right. So that's important to understand.
Right. Final question, and you've touched on it, this exponential growth. So in my books, you're one of the very few people I know who has managed exponentiality, who's started here and gone there, right? And it's very rare. And I'm not sure if it's skill, education, training, mentorship, or just personality and finesse. But if I was an entrepreneur and I was looking for exponentiality, what would be Karl's advice to me?
Okay, so I spoke earlier about the three major factors or three major KPIs you need to focus on. Understand that business is multiplicative. And what I mean by that is business doesn't need to be linear. So if If I've got a metric that I can lift by 10%, another metric I can lift by 10%, another metric by 10%, if you multiply those three together, you're getting 30% growth. So it's multiplicative. So to become exponential doesn't mean that you have to have amazing technology or amazing anything. You've just got to focus on the metrics that are multiplicative and just do them well every day. And by default, you get exponential growth.
Jeez.
Okay. Now breaking that down a bit. If you create multiple efficiencies in your business and multiple growth areas, they come together and create exponentiality. Don't ignore technology. Okay, so we're in a wonderful space with incredible technology available. It's not all applicable all the time, but if you say, how's blockchain going to affect my business? How's AI going to affect my business? How's cloud computing? How's mobile? And you look at each of your distributions strategies and you say, how can I incorporate mobile and get access to a new market? How can I use AI to make a slightly better risk decision? How can I use blockchain to cut my back-end administration? How can I? And if you do all four of them, you're exponential.
Quite right.
So understand the multiplicative behavior of KPIs.
So rather than battle with the quantum, you should just worry about the complexity, because all you're doing is you're mashing into a singular time unit, fixing more than one problem.
Exactly, together.
Jeez, really exciting.
Together.
Really exciting. You're one of the very few people, every time we talk, I got to tell you, I go away going, jeez, I got so much to do. So now I remember case, I remember chicken and egg, I remember the Q12 test, because I'm thinking in my head, got to run it. I remember the NPS, I got to run the NPS too. And we do staff surveys, but I think the way you've kind of spoken about it is really good. And I've now got to go back and go, so what are the matrices that I need to move on the competing set of things I need to worry about? Pick three, and those are the ones I'm focusing on.
Exactly.
It's been such a pleasure, Karl.
Likewise.
Honestly, you're a rock star. So much so that I think we need to do a top and tailor this at some other point, to do a sort of a episode 2. Because I think there's just so much more that we can chat about.
Sure.
That, ladies and gentlemen, is Karl Westvig, the CEO of Retail Capital, a dear friend, and now your mentor too. Cheers.